Well, good evening and welcome to the Japan Society's monthly lecture. My name's Heidi Potter and I'm Chief Executive of the Society and organise events together with my colleagues Alejandra and Kyoko, who are here with me. We're very pleased today to welcome Christine Guth, who has taught at institutions including Princeton, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania and Berkeley. From 2007 till 2016, she led the Asian specialism in the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art's Postgraduate History of Design program. She's also curated shows at the Japan Society in New York, the Katona Museum of Art, and at LACMA. And her publications include The Art of Edo Japan, The Artist in the City, 1615 to 1868, which was published in 1996, and Hokusai's Great Wave, Biography of a Global Icon in 2015. In 2019, she co-authored with Haruhiko Fujita the Encyclopedia of East Asian Design, and her latest book, Craft Culture in Early Modern Japan, Material, Makers, Mastery, will be published in November this year. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Guth to the Japan Society this evening. It's not the first time that she's spoken to us, and I know we will have a wonderful talk, but she will be speaking this evening specifically about the latest research culminating in the book that is just being published, which looks beyond the individual masters or particular art forms to examine the processes and development of craft in a holistic manner. Let me pass straight over to Dr. Christine Guth. Christine, welcome to the Japan Society. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Heidi, Alejandra, and Kyoko for all your help in getting ready for this lecture on Zoom. I only wish that I were in London instead of sitting here. As Heidi mentioned, what I'd like to do today in my talk is offer some fresh perspectives on Japanese crafts, drawing on my just published book. I'd hope to be able to have it to show you, but in fact, I don't have a copy in hand yet. I understand that advanced copies are on their way, but I haven't seen one yet. The book is called Craft Culture in Early Modern Japan, Material, Makers, and Mastery. And what I'd like to talk about today, I'm going to isolate three of its driving themes. First of all, I want to look at the ecological considerations in relation to the access to natural resources that were necessary for craft making. Then I'm going to turn to what I call, borrowing from Richard Sennett, material consciousness. What I mean by that is a sensitivity towards materials that was necessary for craft making then and now, as a matter of fact. And then thirdly, I want to talk about women in craft making, a very much overlooked topic, which I think deserves more attention than has been given in the past. But let me begin with a few introductory remarks about craft and crafts and how I understand these very complex terms in the context of Japan. So a few words about craft and crafts. Crafts have been defined by materials, so let's say lacquer, clay, wood, metal, by techniques, throwing, weaving, forging, and by the functional products that result from the interaction between them. So let's say tea bowl, clothing, household furnishing, swords, among others. In the broadest sense, however, the word craft evokes the human capacity to make, with skills developed through experience. Now, koge, the Japanese word most commonly translated as craft, is a modern coinage, and it carries a great deal of Western cultural baggage. So I avoid it when talking about early modern crafts. Instead, if one were to use a Japanese word, I would use the word saiku, which seems to be the closest equivalent to our understanding of crafts. So I prefer the word saiku, which can be rendered as detailed, with the characters for detailed and craftsmanship. By way of example, during the Tokugawa period, the shogunal offices where lacquerers worked were known as the saiku dokoro. And the overseer of these offices, of this office, was known as the Saiku no Gashira. And there's a whole host of other terms using, of other contexts in which the word Saiku appears. Now, not many, but not all crafts were referred to in this way. But I think that that is a fair approximation of crafts in the early modern context than the word koge. Now, most existing studies of early modern crafts in Japan approach the subject as a linear historical narrative from the perspective of individual masters and media, or within the realm of collecting, curation, and display. In my book, I take a different approach by drawing critical attention to the dynamic, multidirectional network of forces, both material and immaterial, that underlie the extraordinarily rich, diverse, and aesthetically sophisticated culture of Japan during the period from roughly the 1580s to the 1860s. That is from, let's say, the Momoyama through the end of the Tokugawa period. This includes discussion of the particular materials, tools, and people who wield them, but also the institutions, modes of thought, behaviors, and the reciprocal relationships among them. Shared assumptions fundamental to ways and values of making that transcend the specifics of each medium constitute what I call craft culture. My work has been guided by the conviction that craft production doesn't simply involve humans imposing their will on materials using specialized training and equipment. The craft practitioner is only one actor in a complex web whose functioning depends on and incorporates a host of other equally important actors, including media representations, gender, workshops, and the social and physiological training these provide, as well as the spread of technology and innovation. I take an anthropocentric view by positioning the craft maker as the primary referent. But my interpretation of craft culture also draws on the French sociologist Bruno Latour's actor network theory. His work has been especially influential in my thinking because it acknowledges the distribution of agency among both human and non-human forces. Sword makers, for instance, like Yoshihara Yoshindo, who you see on the screen here, have to take into account the agency of iron ore, its ability to change in response to heat and hammering. Potters have to work with the intrinsic property of their materials. Add too much water to clay, and it won't hold its shape. Too little, and it's not malleable. Lacquer sap, urushi, also has agency. The lac tree is a relative of poison ivy, and physical contact with its sap, or even the smell of lacquer wares that are not fully dry, may produce severe allergic reactions. This is one reason why the tapper who you see here is wearing gloves. Consideration of materials, the natural resources available for craft making, and how makers thought about and negotiated with them is one of the major themes running through the book. Craft professionals, whatever their specialty, depended on a reliable supply of raw or semi-processed materials. My book opens with a consideration of the kinds of resources available for craft making in the early modern era and how the need for them was met and sustained when population growth, urbanization, agricultural expansion, and rising standards of living put increasing pressure on the environment. Take lumber, for example. Today, Japan is 67% covered in forest, one of the highest percentages in the modern industrial world. But in 1600, the archipelago, not including Hokkaido, was on the brink of ecological disaster due to deforestation. How did this happen? Well, wood was the primary material for building temples, residences, and castles. It was also essential fuel for heating and firing the kilns for clay roof tiles, as well as for the charcoal used for making arms and armor. Profligate use of lumber for these and other purposes had made deforestation a problem since medieval times. Scarcity and cost are among the factors that are thought to have contributed in the 15th century to changes in residential architecture of the elite, such as the replacement of interior wood paneling with paper sliding doors, fusuma, and wood flooring with rush-covered straw tatami, as are seen in the Togudo Hall at Ginkakuji from the late 15th century. By the late 16th century, the problem had become increasingly acute as population growth required the felling of forests to open new land for rice cultivation. Prime cedars and Japanese cypress, whose height and straight grain made them the preferred timbers for construction, became especially hard to come by. The mountains in the region of the mountains in the capital region that had once supplied wood for Kyoto and Nara's huge temple complexes were exhausted and could no longer meet the needs of new rulers, eager to display their power and authority in monumental architectural form. In 1586, when Hideyoshi sought a tree to serve as ridgepole for Hokoji Temple in Kyoto, one had to be sent from the foot of Mount Fuji, some 200 miles away. You see Hokoji on the left-hand screen. If you follow that rather slender arrow, that's Hokoji Temple. Transporting the wood for the ridgepole to Kyoto from the foot of Mount Fuji took 3 months, required 50,000 man-days of labor, and cost 1,000 ryo in gold, huge sum. Later, fires in the metropolitan centers added to the problem. The Meideki fire of 1657, in which 20% of Edo's population lost their lives, laid waste to Edo Castle, daimyo mansions, the residences of lesser samurai, as well as temples and shrines, and hundreds of blocks of commoner houses. Edo Castle's keep was never rebuilt, owing to the cost and difficulty of finding timber of the requisite size. The scarcity of timber also led to sumptuary regulations enacted in 1663, forbidding woodworkers in Edo from making household articles using the prime woods of cedar or cypress. In response to the scarcity of timber, Tokugawa government officials, as well as regional daimyo, began systematic efforts to manage forests through use regulations and silviculture on the lands under their jurisdiction. The systematic planting of new trees when old ones were cut down, by helping to bring supply and demand into balance, led to greater ecological sustainability, and of course, to the ongoing availability of wood for all kinds of craft activities. Supply and demand of material resources are only part of the story of craft culture. The ability to understand and mobilize the physical properties of materials, what I call, borrowing from Richard Sennett, material consciousness, is especially critical to craft expertise. Craft work of all kinds, then and now, depends on close observation and repeated experimentation with materials and their interactions. Both cognitive and manual skills are inextricably entwined with this evidentiary learning process. Understanding the subtleties of cognitive and corporeal knowledge of materials among early modern craft makers is challenging since we can't observe them directly. But we can learn a great deal about the creative process from finished objects, which are in essence fixed traces of material thinking. The tea bowl on the left, made of papier-mâché covered with lacquer in imitation of rakuware, an example of which is on the right, tellingly speaks to the way the 18th century craft maker Ogawa Haritsu thought about materials. The bowl is comparable in size, shape, and surface to many examples of rakuware, and can in fact serve to prepare and drink tea. A person seeing it for the first time might be taken in by the masquerade, but on closer inspection would notice the brightly colored, inlaid, enamel gourd-shaped decor, which is not customarily used on rakuware tea bowls. And upon picking it up, one would immediately feel the difference in both weight and texture. It is nonetheless an extraordinary simulation of rakuware. To convincingly translate raku ceramics into lacquer required not only technical knowledge and skill, but also considerable reflection about the nature of these two very disparate substances. Haritsu had to simulate the physical properties, texture, and appearance of low-fired and glazed clay, characteristic of raku, using the skills and techniques of his own medium of lacquer. Handling these substances requires very different material consciousness. While raku is carved or hand-built from clay, a malleable material that hardens through firing in a kiln, lacquer, a viscous sap, is cured by polymerization, a hardening process carried out by placing the lacquer-covered object in a dust-free cupboard with an atmosphere with specific relative humidity and temperature. Lacquer, unlike clay, is a substance that cannot hold a form on its own until it is polymerized. Consequently, it is generally applied in many thin layers, or as seen here, over papier-mâché, which renders it protectively resistant to water. Unlike clay, which was dipped into a colored slip or glaze before firing, the liquid lacquer had to be impregnated with an array of colorants to produce the desired warm red or deep black effects of raku. As I've already mentioned, in its raw liquid state, the sap of the lacquer tree is a skin irritant and cannot be manipulated directly with the hands. So its application requires the mediation of a spatula, brush, or other tool. Samples of the tools that are used in lacquer making are on the left. While finished clay vessels register the manual gestures used to form them, the lustrous, polished surface of lacquerwares leaves no such traces. In making his tea bowl, however, Haritsu had to work counterintuitively to produce the coarse appearance of the handmade, an effect most clearly manifested on the ridged base and spiral carved into the foot ring that is a hallmark of rakuware. You see that on the left. This material consciousness did not imply a particular sensitivity to or reverence for nature, but rather a keen awareness of the physical properties of materials and how they interact with one another through the tools and techniques brought to their manipulation. Let me turn now to my third theme, the place of women in early modern craft culture. This is, as I said, one of a number of themes that runs through the book. The converging forces of official class distinctions, professionalization owing to the expansion of the market economy, and Neo-Confucian ideology were critical in reconfiguring the actual role and public perception of women in craft making during the Tokugawa period. With official networks closed to them, it was difficult for women to gain access to professional skills through formal workshops, apprenticeships. But depending on the nature of the practice and familial needs, They could and did acquire craft training. For instance, the wives of several Raku potters who took Buddhist vows after the death of their husbands are known to have made the low-fire glazed ceramics that were a family tradition. And women were likely present in family-run lacquer workshops as well. In this view of one by Kano Yoshinobu, for instance, a woman may be seen on the far right polishing the pole that supports the lacquer clothing stand. Women constituted a significant part of the craft labor force, despite the fact that they were not officially recognized as workshop members. They not only shared the labor of their husbands and other family members, but often also had specialist skills in their own right. Expertise in raising silkworms, spinning, weaving, sewing, and other textile crafts, for instance, was generally passed from mother to daughter. Sericulture was valued as an off-season occupation in farm households, since it brought in income that could compensate for a poor rice harvest. This was especially true in northern regions, where double cropping and warm weather crops such as cotton could not grow. Mulberry trees were not soil specific and could be planted at the edge of fields or on land that might otherwise be wasted. So they were planted very widely all over the country. The rearing of silkworms in the home, immersing the cocoons in hot water to kill the pupae and reel off silk filaments, and combining the multiple strands together to make yarn suitable for weaving, was deemed a specifically female activity. In a system where the entire family functioned as an economic unit, women did work that made it possible for households to function. They cleaned, they raised children, they cooked, and especially they sewed. Whether inside or outside the home, female labor was a necessity. While women practiced many crafts, growing commercialization in the 17th century led them to be relegated to secondary status as assistants in operations that were organized along patriarchal lines. Men dominated the weaving industry in Kyoto's Nishijin district, for instance, and they also figured prominently in commercial embroidery, both activities previously specific to women. Women continued to play a role in single color dyeing, especially indigo, but new colors and specialized multicolored resist dye techniques were developed by dye houses and purveyors of textiles run by men, such as the Kariganeya founded by Ogata Korin and Kenzan's grandfather. Neo-Confucianism held that women's work was economically important, but also morally important, since it taught diligence and self-discipline. All women were expected to work productively. Idleness was deemed morally reprehensible. It's not surprising then that Treasury of Greater Learning for Women, Onadaigaku Takarabako, first published in 1715 and reprinted many times into the Meiji era, should be an informative source on women's craft activities. In many of its pages, the upper register shows women at different craft activities and has commentaries alongside. As part of its Neo-Confucian rhetoric, this publication emphasizes the importance of mastery of the domestic skills of spinning, weaving, and sewing in fulfilling filial piety among women, regardless of background. Aside from these activities, it also depicts a variety of non-domestic crafts appropriate to women of specific classes. The inclusion of such occupational models supports the contention of recent feminist scholarship that it is overly simplistic to see Neo-Confucian ideology as rigidly enforcing women's role solely as wife and mother. Needlework was not regarded simply as a practical activity, but as a form of female self-cultivation, intimately bound up with filial piety. This print of a woman sewing a collar on a kimono, for instance, is part of a series portraying the 5 Confucian virtues through women engaged in various activities. This ideal, the ideal of sewing, which was widely circulated through text and image, was important in supporting the Tokugawa regime, since it was held that needlework materialized the gendered structure, order, and well-being of cosmically ordained and productive domestic life. Mastery of the needle was a common denominator among women of all classes in the early modern era. Homemade garments, like the one that you see on the right here, constituted the bulk of clothing worn at the time, and it was the responsibility of female members of the household to cut, sew, and mend, as well as to disassemble and re-sew garments every time they were washed. Unpicking, re-sewing, patching, and quilting worn garments for reinforcement to extend their lives, like the child's robe seen on the right here, were especially important in poor households in remote rural regions in the northern reaches of Honshu. Greater Treasury of Learning for Women depicts women engaged in a variety of crafts. They make multicolored silk braid, kumihimo. They tie patterns in silk for dyeing, kanokoshibori. They fashion decorative cord from twisted papers, mizuhiki. They mold paper, and they insert the ribs into folding fans. Braid making, kumihimo, which you see here, was a gender-specific craft that required considerable coordination between eye, hand, and even feet. The curious device used for this purpose consisted of a stand with a pole to which one end of the threads was tied to hold them in tension during the braiding process, and attached to another smaller support in front of that, a knife-shaped piece of wood that served much like a beater in weaving to push the woven threads firmly in place. The braider raised and lowered this wooden knife by pulling a string tied to her toe. The braid made in this way was used for obi ties to hold together rolled up hand scrolls, and especially for armor, as you see here. Kanokoshibori is a highly labor-intensive form of tie dyeing, so named because its pattern of small dots resembles the dappled effect of a fawn. It is created by pinching small bits of cloth, then binding them off with thread to resist the dye when immersed in the dye vat. And you can see a woman forming these little knots, these little ties on the left. The aesthetic appeal of kanokoshibori resided not only in the resulting decorative pattern, which you can see in many robes, many kosode of the Edo period, including a very spectacular one in the Victorian Albert Museum. It resided not only in the decorative pattern, but also in that it transformed fabric from a two-dimensional planar surface into a three-dimensional one by leaving traces of the binding process in the form of small tactile peaks that you see on the right. These peaks reveal the actions of the anonymous craft women who bound them. That the manufacture of folding fans was dominated by women is confirmed by the frequency of its representation in many illustrated books and prints. The Saiga Shokunin Burui, various classes of artisans and colored pictures from 1770, of which the British Museum has by far the best edition, and you see it here, is a case in point. Although the two elegantly attired women are depicted in a highly idealized manner, the picture accurately conveys the work and tools involved. The woman on the right holds a fan that she has just pleated. A ruler used to form the creases and two other pleated fans lie nearby. Her elongated fingers speak to the manual dexterity required to carry out this work. The large lacquer box behind her contains unpleated painted fans in preparation for her work. The woman facing her holds a completed fan in her hands. Lying next to her on the ground are the bamboo ribs that are inserted into the fan and the paste brush used to glue the front and back papers together. Papermaking was by far the most economically important of the non-domestic crafts represented in Treasury of Greater Learning for women. Although carried out in workshops in Kyoto and Edo, it was more common in the provinces where the requisite natural resources were available. Kunisaki Jihei, the author of Kamisuki Chohoki, a handy guide to papermaking, which was published in 1798, confirms women's central role in this craft. His comments, however, are framed in a misogynistic rhetoric that was very typical of the times, and I will quote, "How true the saying that an ordinary person living at his ease can be up to no good. A woman with leisure is without doubt the source of all evil and an indication of a degenerate country. Many are the kinds of paper made to profit the nation by women with a thought to time not spent in the fields," end quote. So much for Kamisuki Jihei. With the exception of papermaking, which required manipulating large and heavy pulp filled screens, as you see on the left-hand side here, most of the crafts depicted in Greater Treasury of Learning for Women involved manual dexterity rather than physical strength. Yet women were by no means excluded from such activities. In large pottery workshops in Arita, such as the one depicted in Sansai Meisan-zue, they were often beasts of burden, carrying heavy loads of clay, and were also assigned the task of kneading the clay. While they could assist with the delicate task of painting the wares, they were generally excluded from the use of the potter's wheel and certainly from firing the kiln. Women faced considerable structural and ideological obstacles in gaining recognition for their skills, since they could not become official members of workshops. While their talents might be acknowledged within the extended family, recognition in the public domain was rare and achieved chiefly through forms of mediation dominated by men. One example of this is the comb maker Oroku, who is celebrated in a number of woodblock prints, such as this one by Hiroshige, in a series of fan prints titled A Collection of Famous Artisans. This one is another one, is a work in the V&A. Oroku, the devoted daughter of poverty-stricken parents, prayed to the god of Sua for assistance. Her prayers were answered when the deity recommended that she carve combs from minebari, Asian alder, and sell them to travelers on the Kisokaido Road. Minebari, this Asian alder, was a wood that was in plentiful supply in the mountain passes near the village of Narai, where she lived. And Narai was one of the post stations on the Kisokaido Road, so there were frequent tourists there. These combs, distinguished by their exceptionally fine teeth, had been sold at the mountainous Narai post station on the Kisokaido Road since the early 18th century. But their later nationwide celebrity dates to the 19th century, when the prolific writer and influential cultural luminaries, Ota Nampo, Santo Kyoden, and Kyokutei Bakin all wrote about them. All wrote about her and about these combs. However talented she may have been, Oroku's renown was dependent on representation as a local heroine in prints, popular literature, and theater, which speaks to the role of print culture in mediating the understanding of craft people during the early modern era, and that the mediating role of print culture is another theme in my book, but I don't have time to develop it today. In craft culture in early modern Japan, I expose how people thought about, visualized, and practiced crafts, focusing on both creative processes and their outcomes. I show how craft making is beyond individual human control, inextricably connected to larger environmental, economic, political, sociocultural, gender, and technological systems. But alongside these macro level issues, I also highlight the importance of micro level practices and bodily habits that makers brought to their materials through their extended training. I emphasize that crafts are not simply material things. They also belong to their maker's world of the sensual, of experience, and even of emotion. Taking into account these mind-body considerations in a wider cultural context throws into relief the remarkable resourcefulness, resiliency, skill, ingenuity, and creativity that early modern makers brought to their craft. Thank you.
Christine, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. We covered such a lot of ground. There were a couple of remarks that were being made.
The question was asking, basically making a comment about how the wife of national living treasure Furuta Kozo was actually making the famous Hon Minogami, and this person saw many other women also doing that craft. He's saying that the kozo needed for making washi, it was almost all imported, and there are almost no Japanese kozo farmers. Do you have any insights about that way of working, Christine?
Well, it's interesting that he saw women at work, because as I point out, they were certainly a very important part of paper making in early modern Japan, but they haven't generally been acknowledged as such. And note that her husband is the one noted who is the national treasure, and although she's part of the process, she's probably not publicly acknowledged. So that's sort of a general response to the first part. But the second part of your observation is very interesting. And I do touch on this in the introduction to my book about contemporary craft makers. There's a great deal of concern among contemporary craft makers that the requisite raw materials are no longer available, kozo among them. But for example, so kozo is purchased from abroad, but the area that I'm most familiar with, lacquer making, a lot of lacquer sap is being imported from Southeast Asia because it's so costly to produce, and there's so few plantations still in modern Japan where that supply the lacquer. So yes, the importation of raw materials is very much a part of contemporary craft making. It was part of early modern craft making, but for specific crafts. Again, speaking of one that I'm particularly familiar with, sword hilts were covered with ray skin. The handles were covered with ray skin, and ray skins were imported in the hundreds of thousands during the early modern period from Southeast Asia. And without them, you wouldn't have the vast number of swords or the many other forms of crafts, chests that are covered in ray skin as well, without those imports. So yes, imports were and continue to be important, imported raw materials. And thank you for that question.
So Christine, when you very kindly, what feels like a million years ago, but pre-COVID, shared a chapter about, particularly to do with deforestation and the like, you made an interesting argument that you haven't really touched on in your brief summary about the way that the fact that ecological considerations were growing through the Edo period gives the lie to all sorts of false, traditional, time-honored Western interpretations about Japanese respect for materials and Zen and all that kind of thing. And that was so fascinating. I wonder if you could spare just a minute to comment on that issue.
It's such a complex issue, I decided not to talk about it here. But before I try to just sort of say a few words, first of all, I want to thank you, Joe, because you are I am indebted to so many people. I don't think in any of my previous publications I have consulted as many people as I did here. And Joe is one of the people who was very, very helpful. So I want to thank you publicly for that. But yes, so one of my arguments in one of the themes, one of the arguments that I try to make in the book is that to talk about a love of nature is really misguided. And I try to redirect that attention to nature by talking instead about material consciousness that craftsmen bring. And material, being aware of and sensitive to your materials has nothing to do with a love of nature. It has to do with, I think, very pragmatic, practical considerations. And I think many of the attitudes that we project today onto traditional Japanese craftsmen and their handling of natural materials are, to a large extent, nostalgia and anachronistic projections of modern environmental concerns. So in short, that's my position, which may in some eyes be somewhat controversial, but I think that is a fair assessment. I don't know, would you agree, Joe?
Yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense to me. And another thing which I wish I'd remembered to share with you at the time, which is a couple of years ago, is that, of course, we think about the making of swords and the making of sword fittings as being exclusively very, very much male activities. And I was delighted to find, actually in my work for Bonhams, we came across a sword guard, I think in 2017, where the whole piece was decorated by members of the same family. And it actually includes a signed little section, a little bit of applied decoration that's by a woman called Fumiko. And I would love to share the detail of that with you, because that's perfectly extraordinary.
That is amazing. I would love to know about that. Yeah. Thank you.
The third thing is that somewhat relevant, it was slightly irrelevant, but also relevant, is that yesterday I was privileged to be given a very detailed guided tour of the interior of York Minster, where I happen to be. And inside the chapter house, which is one of the most amazing structures of the British Middle Ages, which I think is 14th century, the king post there, would you believe, is made of the thing that bears the weight of the whole roof. And the roof itself has to be built to carry the weight of the king post. It's made of 3 entire oak trees. And that really, put me in mind of the fact that this tremendous demand on the environment is not something that's confined to medieval Japan, but also is very, and we were at a wedding reception that was held in Merchant Adventurers Hall, which combines the Lord knows how many fantastic trees that were poured into the manufacture of that. So this is kind of worldwide phenomenon that has nearly enough attention.
Agreed. I see Radu.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Christine. As always, watching your talks is very thought-provoking. And it made me especially think of these ukiyo-e images that we show, of lovely ladies doing crafts. And I always thought these were sort of
Mitate.
Idealizations. Yes, mitate. And now, watching a talk, I realized that's actually a bit of visual recognition of the women's agency. But I still don't know how to tell them apart, right? There are really idealized mitate, and that maybe there's a continuum, right? Where, do you have any tips on how to kind of break down these images and understand if they're idealized or not?
I don't think there's a simple formula, but I think that in some cases, the representation of women, in prints that we would think more in terms of bijin or mitate, reflect reality. One of the examples, a fictional example of women involved in crafts, which I think probably reflects reality, think opens up the possibility that women were involved in many more ways than we could possibly imagine. There is a story in Saikaku, I can't off the top of my head remember where, about women being employed in the palace as carpenters for the women's quarters, because men had to be interviewed and they were so worried about men being in the women's quarters, so they hired women to describe them. And I mean, the description in Saikaku is so precise that it really sounded to me as if it were based on reality. And so I think if we start looking, we're going to find a lot more examples of women in the crafts. It's just that people haven't looked before in any systematic, I mean, we've looked a lot at painting, but not in the crafts yet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question or a comment by Kylie.
Hi, thank you. Yes, thank you, Christine. That was fascinating. And I've got your book on pre-order, so I'm looking forward to that when it arrives. I'm a maker and crafter. I do kumihimo and I make shifuku ceremony for chado. And one of the things I have noticed and come across is the way that within kind of a sphere, there's the different parts of the craft are so broken off and so mastery only in one area, mastery only in another area. So only kumihimo makers make kumihimo. You know, that in Japan, the people who make shifuku don't get involved with anything except sewing the piece together. Whereas I sew the piece together, I make my own kumihimo. I do all of that. Is this? I'm guessing it's a common thing across a lot of the crafts that different parts are so specialized and so their own crafts within their own crafts kind of division.
Yeah, I think the rise of the commodification of the crafts in the early 17th century gave rise to an incredible amount of specialization. And in one of my chapters, I look very closely at Jinrin Kimozui, which is a kind of occupational encyclopedia. And if you look, it was published in 1690. And if you compare the range of crafts represented there with the range of crafts that are represented in hand scrolls from the previous eras, it's quite dramatic. And you can see crafts that were once unified. Just to give you an example, before the Edo period, you would find representations of lacquer makers. But in Jinrin Kimozui, the lacquer makers are separated into makieshi, the lacquerers who work with, who make pictorial lacquers, nurimonoshi, those who simply cover simple bowls with red or black, and then tsuimonoshi, those who do carved lacquer. And that's typical of the kind of breakdown. And these are all individual crafts. So I think what you are talking about has deep roots. And there was a lot of territoriality in each one of these as well.
Still is.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It's interesting just to see it in other places as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I remember talking to Rebecca Salter, who was doing some research into the printmakers and filming the people who made the batten and the people who carved the blocks. And there were about, I don't know how many different types of craftsperson creating the tools with which to even start making the prints, and how these were all dying out, and the problems that was causing, which is I mean, is that something you see throughout these more so-called traditional crafts, or
you mean dying out? And in the other period, well,
I mean, I suppose I'm thinking about today now as they.
Yes. So some of the questions that I address in my book were prompted by some research trips that I made to Japan and encounters I had with contemporary crafts practitioners, and among them were some embroiderers, people who actually a husband-wife team who have a workshop and who embroider kimono for theaters, but also, very, very fancy ones. And I spent quite a bit of time talking to the wife of the couple. And she told me that one of the big concerns is that they use special silk threads, which are all dyed following poetic colors described in Heian literature. And that the craft person who dyes these silks has no apprentice. And so she was very concerned about the future of embroidery if you can't get, these specialized dyed, these threads dyed in very special colors. So there certainly are, there are traditional crafts that are dying out. On the other hand, and this is a theme that I really emphasize, I think it's really a mistake to look at so-called traditional Japanese crafts as sort of locked in time, as not becoming involved in change and transformation. This workshop, for example, this workshop specialized in embroidery, has a website, bilingual website. They have, so that people can order from them. They have adapted their traditional skills to make things like eyeglass cases and handbags. And they have even done work in very fancy embroidery for Paris fashion houses like Hermès and Cher.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I think successful craft people in the early modern period and today are always prepared to adapt and to innovate as need be.
Thank you. So MH has asked two questions, and one is whether your book discusses how the modern Japanese term for craft, how the term came about and why it's problematic. And somebody else has asked a follow-up question and asking, maybe you mentioned at the beginning, but wondered if you could explain a bit more about the term craft culture. What are your thoughts about translating koge as craft and the choice some people have made to leave koge untranslated in English publications?
Okay, so no, I do not address the thorny issue of koge. I think enough has been written about it. There are, lots and lots of books in Japanese, and there are a number of good articles that take up this debate. I think, for modern crafts, I think there's every reason to use the word craft instead of koge. But because the word craft was very rarely used until the Meiji period, I felt it was better to avoid it. And as I said, I found the word saiku in all sorts of places, and I just thought that was much closer. The second part of the question was about craft culture. So by calling my book Craft Culture, and what I mean by craft culture is that I wasn't going to focus on makers specifically. I wasn't going to focus specifically on made things. But what I was going to try to do was to bring a more holistic approach to craft, one that took into account processes, and that looked at craft processes in a way that transcended the specifics of individual media. So, for example, what I spoke about a little bit today, material consciousness. It doesn't matter whether you're working with lacquer, whether you're working with ceramic, whether you're working with textiles. Every craft person working with a particular media has to be sensitive to that material. So I hope, MH, that answers your question.
Okay, and the second half of the question is how was self-cultivation through crafts expressed for women? Was it primarily in the form of moral cultivation, or was it also some bodily cultivation as well?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I mean, the answer is both. I think the two are inseparable, particularly in the case of women. Becoming accomplished particularly in the domestic crafts was a way of fulfilling one's moral duty as a woman. But learning particular crafts, whether sewing, weaving, paper making, whatever, all of these crafts gave women certain bodily habits. It taught them how to behave in certain ways, both in the act of making, but also outside of the making. I mean, it inculcated behaviors, specifically gendered behaviors. And I go into that in some detail. Certain crafts practiced by women, in particular sewing, did receive acknowledgement in that they were recognized often with the word do, michi, in the same way, like chado. Then that was a kind of honorific that I think reflected the respect that was gained by becoming a good seamstress. So those are sort of little fragments of my thoughts. I can't bring them all together right now to answer the question, which is a very good and complex one. But I hope that somewhat addresses it.
That's great. Thank you very much. I suppose this is going a little bit back to your comment during the talk, Christine, when you talked about the deforestation and the kind of decline of availability of resources. And Isa's commented, it's a kind of comment rather than question, but about the island of Yakushima, which very recently has become a nature reserve, but only after all the huge cedars were cut down for shingles by the order of the shogun. So was there no real concept of protecting nature at the time, or?
Well, there certainly was a desire to protect natural resources that could be used in some practical, functional way. And over the course of the 17th century, most daimyo enacted reforestation policies. They also enacted, particularly in the north, they enacted policies to plant lacquer trees in order to foster local production. There were also, among many daimyo, efforts to systematically plant kozo for paper making. So anything that could improve domainal finances that depended on natural resources, the daimyo were out there not only giving orders to grow these resources, but also sending out farming advisors to provide advice on how best to grow a particular plant or tree. So there were very active policies.
But it was from what you're saying, it's linked to the adding to the value of the domain.
It was very pragmatic. It had nothing to do with a love of nature. It was pragmatic and mercantile, if you want.
Yeah. That makes sense, perfect sense. There's one other question, which is, how does Minge relate to your talk, in the sense of what's the relationship Minge and Koge, Saiku? How do they all relate?
Thank you. That's a good question. So I don't use Minge. The idea of Minge is sort of a contemporary, modern construct. So I talk about it a little bit in my introduction. Only to say that in this study, I downplay the division between urban and rural crafts. And I think, I don't go into this, but I think a lot of writing about Minge brings a great deal of modern nostalgia to practices that were highly commercialized. Even the most remote craft practitioners in, say, Echizen, who were making fabric using asa, they were connected through mercantile networks to the major roadways, riverways, highways, and thence to major cities. So the idea of sort of self-contained craft people in the countryside who were not thinking about how to make a living, they were primarily concerned with their craft, is a kind of utopia that never existed. At least I believe.
Well, Christine, we've taken huge amounts of your time this evening, and it's been fascinating to hear the results of the fruits of your research. I know that a lot of us are looking forward to getting our hands on your book and to reading ourselves in.
So am I.
But for this evening, thanks again, Christine Guth. It's been wonderful to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you.